The forest is silent in a way that feels unnatural, so quiet it seems the world is holding its breath. Snow hangs heavy on every branch of the Ardennes pines, bending them toward the ground, their weight pressing the landscape into a slow, suffocating stillness. A pale winter light filters through the dense canopy, cold and colorless, giving the forest the look of an abandoned world. It is the morning of December 18, 1944, one day after the German breakthrough that stunned the Allied front. In this frozen wilderness, a small group of American infantrymen crawls through waist-deep snow, their breath hanging in the air like smoke from dying fires. None of them speak. Even their movement feels muted, as though the snow is swallowing every sound before it has a chance to escape. Helmets glint dully beneath frost. Rifle barrels tremble slightly in the frigid air. Hands, already stiff from hours of cold, try to grip steel that feels more like ice. Every man knows that somewhere ahead, somewhere beyond the white curtain of trees, German troops are moving too, slipping silently through the forest with the same brutal purpose. Private Collins is in the lead, pressing his body low against the snow. His cheeks are raw from windburn, frost clings to the fabric of his balaclava. With gloved hands, he pushes aside branches heavy with snow, careful not to let anything snap. Behind him, Sergeant Walker signals with 2 fingers, slow, steady advance. Walker's breath escapes in deep bursts, drifting upward before vanishing into the frozen pines. He's been in the army long enough to hide fear from his men, but not long enough to silence the instinct that tells him they are being watched. The forest feels alive with quiet menace. Every shifting branch, every distant groan of ice settling on a tree trunk feels like the metallic click of a rifle bolt being drawn back. No one knows exactly where the Germans are. Intelligence reports contradict one another. Patrols have vanished without a trace. Stories pass between units, stories of American positions overrun in minutes, of tanks rolling out of the fog like metal ghosts, of German soldiers wearing captured American uniforms to move unnoticed across the snowy terrain. In the Ardennes, even the trees seem like enemies. Collins raises a fist. The squad freezes. Ahead, just beyond a mound of snow, faint movement flickers between the branches. Walker motions for spacing. Weapons rise. Boots shift carefully to avoid crunching ice. Time seems to slow. Every heartbeat becomes thunder. Suddenly, a distant explosion echoes from the west, dull, heavy, rolling through the forest like a giant exhaling. The men flinch, shoulders tightening, but they don't break formation. Artillery has been pounding American lines since dawn, each boom a grim reminder that they are not facing scattered German patrols but a full-scale assault. And yet here, in this pocket of silent white wilderness, the war feels intensely personal, man to man, tree to tree, breath to breath. Walker inches forward, scanning the forest through the iron sights of his M1. His boots sink deep into the powder. He presses behind a fallen log bitten by frost, raising one hand to slow the squad. Collins shifts to flank left, moving with exaggerated caution as his body disappears behind thick pine branches. The man behind him, Corporal Ruiz, lowers himself almost flat to the ground, crawling forward with his face inches above the snow. Steam rises from his breath, curling around the barrel of his Thompson submachine gun. Ruiz's heartbeat thunders in his ears. He grips his weapon tighter. The silence feels wrong. Too perfect. Too still. Then he sees it, fresh footprints, half filled with powder but still sharp around the edges. Someone passed through here minutes ago. He taps the snow twice to signal Walker. The sergeant studies the tracks. They angle northeast, deeper into the woods, toward a ridge known to provide a clear view of the American supply routes. If German scouts have reached that high ground, the entire battalion could be in danger. Walker signals for the squad to fan out. They move carefully, slowly, their forms merging with the white landscape like shadows of movement. As the men advance, the thick quiet of the forest begins to change. A faint murmur, soft, rhythmic, travels through the trees. It takes a moment for the men to realize what it is. Voices. German voices. Close. Walker drops to one knee, raising his fist sharply. The squad freezes again, hearts pounding, senses sharpened to razor edges. Ruiz crawls to the right, positioning himself behind a snow-covered stump. He wipes frost from his goggles, straining to see through the tight mesh of branches ahead. The voices grow clearer, 2, maybe 3 men speaking in hushed tones. A crack of laughter follows, short and sharp, slicing through the cold air. The Americans exchange glances. The Germans sound relaxed. Comfortable. Maybe they believe the woods are empty. Maybe they think no American patrol would dare come this deep into the white labyrinth. But Walker has orders: patrol the sector, locate enemy movement, report back by nightfall. And right now, the enemy is less than 30 yards away. He motions to Collins. The private nods and crawls toward a snowbank offering a clearer line of sight. His breath trembles. His fingers burn with cold. His heart feels too loud in his chest. He eases up, just enough to peer over the snow. There they are. 3 German soldiers stand beside a tree, rifles slung casually across their shoulders. They are wearing thick winter coats, scarves, mittens, gear far better suited to these temperatures than what the Americans received. They talk quietly, stamping their boots against the cold. One points toward the south, gesturing across the forest as though explaining something. Collins sinks back behind cover, his mind racing. Walker leans close, whispering, barely audible. How many? 3. Maybe more behind the ridge. Walker nods. He glances at his men. Their faces are tense, eyes sharp. They wait for his decision. The sergeant studies the forest. The wind picks up slightly, carrying snow from the branches in soft white flurries. He weighs the possibilities. Engaging 3 men could expose their position. But letting them reach the ridge could doom hundreds. He leans forward again, whispering. We take them quietly. The squad prepares. Ruiz checks his Thompson. Collins repositions to get a better angle. Snow crunches faintly under boots. Hearts pound. Breath clouds. Walker raises his hand. For a long moment, the world stands still, frozen between violence and silence. Then, Walker drops his hand. The snow explodes into motion. The early morning of December 16, 1944, brought an eerie calm over the Ardennes forest. Frost covered every branch, every leaf, and a thick layer of snow blanketed the ground, hiding the turmoil that was about to erupt. First Lieutenant Lyle Bu crouched in his foxhole atop Lanzerath Ridge, scanning the darkened horizon for signs of movement. His 20 years of life had not prepared him for what lay ahead. Far away, his family in St. Louis was preparing for Christmas, unaware that their son was leading 18 men of the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon, 3rd Battalion, 94th Infantry Regiment, into the path of an entire German Panzer division. The days leading up to this morning had been quiet. Reports from the German lines suggested nothing unusual, but Bu sensed a change, a tension in the air that he could not explain. Across the valley, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers waited, backed by tanks and artillery, ready to launch Hitler's desperate gamble, the offensive that would later be remembered as the Battle of the Bulge. The stakes could not have been higher, and standing in their path were Bu and his men, outnumbered and outgunned, yet determined to hold their position. By dawn, the first signs of the German advance became visible. Paratroopers moved silently through the snow-covered forest below the ridge, approaching a small American outpost in the village of Lanzerath. Bu's position gave him a clear view of the road below, and he immediately radioed headquarters to report the activity. He was met with disbelief. Intelligence insisted no German units were present in that area. Bu knew differently. He watched as the soldiers walked past his concealed positions, capturing the village with ease. The choice was agonizing: engage and risk annihilation, or stay hidden and let the Germans occupy the village uncontested. Bu stayed silent, choosing to preserve the lives of his men, but he knew the real battle was only beginning. As the morning wore on, waves of German paratroopers advanced up the ridge, expecting minimal resistance. Bu's platoon was ready. They had dug their foxholes strategically, creating overlapping fields of fire designed to maximize their defensive advantage. The first German assault met with a hail of bullets. Soldiers fell into the snow, screaming, some trying desperately to reach cover. Each successive attack was met with the same relentless fire. Over and over, the Germans were repelled. By mid-afternoon, the ridge was littered with the bodies of enemy soldiers, a grim testament to the resolve and ingenuity of 18 Americans holding the line against overwhelming odds. Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper, commanding the German advance, could not comprehend the resistance. His timetable was slipping away. He had expected to reach the Meuse River in 24 hours, but the small ridge held by BU's platoon delayed his force by nearly an entire day. The narrow forest roads prevented the tanks from bypassing the ridge, forcing them to wait while their infantry struggled to break the American defense. Peiper's frustration grew, and his messages became increasingly desperate. Threats of court-martial were sent to the paratroop commanders, but the tactical reality could not be altered by words alone. Night fell, and though BU's men had been forced to retreat under heavy mortar fire, their delay had already altered the course of the offensive. Over 90 German soldiers had been killed in the defense of the ridge, and the advantage of surprise that Hitler had counted on was slipping from the German grasp. Every small victory, every moment bought by BU and his men, allowed reinforcements to mobilize and prepare a stronger defense further west. By the morning of December 17th, the advancing German column, still under Peiper's command, moved on towards Stavelot, encountering pockets of American resistance and facing the reality of dwindling fuel and supplies. At critical junctures, American engineers blew bridges under enemy fire, halting the advance of Panther and Tiger tanks. Every bridge that Peiper's men approached seemed to erupt in flames at the last possible moment. Roads were blocked, supply lines severed, and the offensive's timetable unraveled piece by piece. What should have been a swift armored advance became a series of desperate engagements, each one draining strength and morale from the elite German troops. At the village of Franca-Champamps, Major Paul Solis faced an impossible decision. The Americans were outnumbered and outgunned, but a massive fuel depot stood between the advancing Germans and their goal. Without fuel, the offensive could not continue, yet defending the depot with available troops was impossible. In a split-second decision, Solis ordered the destruction of the gasoline. Drums were rolled into the roads, punctured, and ignited, creating walls of flame that shot 30 feet into the air. The heat was intense enough to be felt from hundreds of yards away, and black smoke billowed into the winter sky, blocking the path of the German advance. Peiper watched helplessly from a distance as millions of gallons of fuel went up in flames, realizing that the offensive he had been ordered to lead had been dealt a devastating blow. The decision to burn the fuel, made without consultation, exemplified the courage and improvisation that defined the American defense. Each act, whether by soldiers holding a ridge or engineers destroying bridges, contributed to the unraveling of Hitler's plan. By December 19th, Peiper's forces had reached Sturmhorn, only to find the full strength of the American defense awaiting them. The 119th Infantry Regiment of the 30th Division had prepared positions within stone buildings, creating lethal interlocking fields of fire. Tanks of the 740th Battalion supplemented the infantry, and artillery was pre-registered on every approach. While German Panthers and Tigers should have dominated the battlefield, the narrow streets and close-quarters combat negated their advantages. American soldiers used bazookas and tank destroyers to devastating effect, knocking out German armor at close range. The battle was apocalyptic, with buildings burning and bodies lying in the snow. Every street became a killing ground, every house a fortress. Peiper's initial successes had led to nothing but attrition and exhaustion. By December 20th, fuel and ammunition were nearly depleted. His forces were isolated and surrounded. The anticipated resupply by the Luftwaffe failed. Parachutes carrying much-needed provisions drifted away, landing behind American lines. German troops scavenged what little remained, but it was not enough. Desperation set in as the Americans slowly tightened the noose, attacking from multiple directions and cutting off potential escape routes. The elite SS soldiers who had once been the spearhead of Hitler's conquests now faced an unrelenting enemy in ordinary American soldiers who refused to yield. By Christmas Eve, only small groups of German soldiers remained capable of fighting. They abandoned their vehicles and moved through the forest under cover of darkness, carrying only their personal weapons and whatever provisions they could salvage. The battlefield was littered with destroyed tanks, abandoned armored cars, and the remnants of what had once been an unstoppable force. The Tiger II, the most formidable tank of the war, sat immobile in the snow, a silent monument to failure. Out of 4,800 men who had begun the offensive with Peiper, fewer than 800 had survived to return to German lines. The rest were dead, wounded, or captured. The Americans had transformed the tide of the Battle of the Bulge through courage, ingenuity, and an unyielding determination to resist. Ordinary soldiers, engineers, and officers alike contributed to the collapse of one of Germany's most elite units. Each small act of resistance compounded into an overwhelming failure for the Germans, proving that even the most formidable divisions could be defeated by those who refused to surrender. The morning mist clung stubbornly to the Ardennes forest, a pale veil over the twisted trunks and snow-laden underbrush. From the dense tree line, a low, mechanical growl began to emerge, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the frozen earth itself. The first Panthers appeared, their dark silhouettes moving with a menacing grace along the narrow forest trails. Behind them, half-tracks rattled, their metal tracks crunching against the icy snow, each vehicle a harbinger of destruction. The American infantry, caught in a precarious defensive line, could only watch as these armored beasts advanced, their engines masking the distant cries of men and the faint rattle of small arms fire from earlier skirmishes. Within moments, the forest erupted into chaos. American anti-tank teams scrambled, dragging cumbersome weapons into makeshift positions between the trees, their fingers stiff with cold, their breaths forming clouds that mingled with smoke from previous firefights. The first Panthers loomed into firing range, their long 75mm barrels swinging with deliberate precision. An American soldier fired his bazooka, the recoil jolting his frozen arms, and a Panther shuddered violently as the projectile struck its side. Smoke and sparks erupted, a brief victory in the relentless storm of German aggression, but the advance did not falter. For every vehicle destroyed, two more seemed to take its place, pushing the defenders further back into the dense forest undergrowth. The narrow trails through the Ardennes became lethal choke points. Trees scarred by artillery and previous engagements now served as twisted barricades, forcing both sides into a deadly game of maneuvering and counterfire. Snow, churned into gray slush by treads and boots alike, coated everything in a filthy frost. The Germans, trained for blitzkrieg, attempted to maintain momentum, yet the terrain that should have offered them speed now hampered their tanks, slowing them just enough for the Americans to exploit. Explosions tore through the quiet, the sound bouncing off the trees like echoes in a frozen cathedral. The scent of burnt fuel mixed with the crisp winter air, a grim perfume that settled over both victor and victim alike. American artillery observers, positioned on slight rises where the snow had thinned, called in fire on exposed vehicles. Each shell that struck the advancing column ignited clouds of black smoke, temporarily halting the German momentum. Half-tracks skidded into ditches, immobilized by deep drifts or the icy ruts carved by their own treads. Infantrymen, huddled in foxholes and behind fallen logs, seized these fleeting moments, picking off German gunners with carefully aimed rifle shots. Yet for all their efforts, the forest seemed to surge with relentless armored determination. The Americans knew that the battle would not be won with a single shot but with patience, tenacity, and the brutal leveraging of terrain. Amidst this, small squads moved with quiet desperation, trying to flank the German armor. Snow crunched underfoot as soldiers crept through the underbrush, avoiding open spaces where the long barrels of Panther guns could slice through cover like knives. Every fallen tree and hidden ditch became a sanctuary and a trap in equal measure. Some squads managed to disable a half-track here, a Panther there, but the cost was immediate and visible: comrades lost to bullets, frostbite, or sheer exhaustion. Communications were frantic. Messengers ran between positions, relaying updates and desperate requests for reinforcements, their words lost at times to the roar of engines and the cracks of rifles. The air was alive with a tense rhythm, the growl of engines, the staccato of small arms, the distant thunder of artillery. Visibility, limited by falling snow and smoke, transformed the forest into a patchwork of shadows and fleeting glimpses. Every movement was scrutinized, every sound analyzed. German tank commanders shouted orders, their voices harsh but disciplined, trying to keep their units aligned on trails that twisted unpredictably. American teams adapted in real time, shifting positions, laying mines where the snow allowed, setting traps with anti-tank explosives. For the men on the ground, it was a deadly game of inches, each decision a potential difference between life and death. Despite the ferocity of the German push, the forest itself became a silent ally to the defenders. Trees tore at treads, roots snagged tracks, and uneven ground forced vehicles into predictable paths. Smoke from burning engines curled into the cold sky, a beacon marking temporary victories and signaling danger for those nearby. In these moments, the Americans saw the first glimmers of hope. Panthers that could not maneuver through tight turns, half-tracks that bogged down in snowdrifts, and gunners exposed for mere seconds became immediate targets. Each disabled vehicle, each halted advance, represented a small but crucial win in an otherwise overwhelming scenario. As hours passed, the rhythm of attack and defense created a strange, hypnotic cadence. The forest was alive with the pulse of war, the relentless push of German armor, the improvised defenses of American infantry, the cold, unyielding landscape shaping every movement. Men grew weary, muscles stiff from cold and exertion, yet adrenaline kept them moving, firing, and planning the next move. For the Americans, every destroyed Panther or half-track was a signal, a confirmation that, even in the shadow of seemingly unstoppable mechanized might, determination, courage, and strategy could bend the course of battle, if only slightly, in their favor. By late afternoon, the forest bore the scars of the armored onslaught. Trails were gouged with deep ruts, the snow stained with soot, blood, and oil. The sound of engines, while still present, seemed slower, more labored, as the Germans struggled to maintain cohesion through the treacherous terrain. American AT teams, having endured hours of tension, reorganized, reinforcing weak points and preparing for the next assault. The forest, though battered, had not yielded. The advance had been slowed, controlled, and turned into a series of costly gambles for the Germans. For the men on both sides, the day had tested the limits of endurance, skill, and resolve, setting the stage for the relentless struggle that would continue in the villages and crossroads beyond the trees. The villages of Stoumont, La Glise, and the surrounding hamlets now stood as grim testaments to the brutality of war. Once quiet places, their cobblestone streets and timber-framed houses had been transformed into deadly arenas where every alley, every corner, and every doorway could conceal a gunner ready to strike. Snow fell relentlessly, coating the rooftops and the remnants of barricades with a deceptive calm that belied the chaos below. Civilians huddled in basements, their terrified whispers mixing with the distant echo of artillery, while the streets themselves had become a macabre chessboard for American and German forces alike. German tanks prowled through the narrow streets, their treads grinding against cobblestones and their 75mm guns swinging with lethal intent. The confined spaces, ideal for defensive ambushes, now worked both for and against the attackers. Sherman and Panzer crews alike cursed under their breath, aware that one wrong turn could mean destruction. Smoke from burning vehicles curled up into the gray sky, intertwining with the clouds of powder and snow, creating a haze through which the fighting continued almost invisibly. Each intersection became a point of deadly confrontation, a kill zone where a single misstep could cost dozens of lives. American infantry, dug in along corners and behind barricades, waited with rifles, bazookas, and machine guns. Their breath steamed in the frigid air as they scanned for movement, fingers numb yet steady on triggers. As a Panzer rounded a bend, a squad fired a coordinated volley, rounds hitting the armored beast with sparks and dented steel. It lurched, momentarily stalled, giving American soldiers just enough time to leap from cover and throw satchel charges, immobilizing it completely. The cacophony of gunfire, shouted orders, and metal-on-metal collisions filled the streets, bouncing off walls and creating an auditory maze that made every step perilous. Civilians, caught in the crossfire, fled whenever possible. Mothers clutched children, and men dragged what they could carry, moving in haphazard columns through side alleys, often only to be forced back by advancing armor or artillery shells. Basements became temporary sanctuaries, but the echoes of battle seeped even there, the cracks of rifles, the thundering of tank engines, the shouts of soldiers. Fear was omnipresent, palpable in every hurried footstep, in every glance over a shoulder, in every heartbeat that seemed to match the rhythm of distant explosions. The towns themselves, once safe havens, now served as unyielding extensions of the forest battlefield, their narrow streets amplifying the carnage. American artillery units, stationed on the outskirts and able to target streets and intersections, brought down thunderous fire on exposed vehicles and German troop concentrations. Each shell struck with a violent precision, flinging debris and creating temporary choke points. Panthers and half-tracks overturned in the snow, their crews thrown into frigid, merciless streets. Smoke and fire transformed familiar streets into tunnels of destruction, making it impossible for any force to advance without extreme caution. Even as Germans attempted to push forward, they were funneled into traps carefully laid by defenders who understood that the urban landscape could multiply their firepower and offset the enemy's numerical advantage. The winter air was thick with tension, a mixture of fear, adrenaline, and determination. Every shot fired, every explosion, every scream became part of a relentless rhythm. Street by street, block by block, the American defenders fought back with ingenuity. Barricades were reinforced with overturned carts, wooden beams, and rubble. Sniper positions were established in attics and behind shattered windows. Each soldier knew that the momentary advantage could shift in an instant. One missed shot could allow a German crew to escape or regroup. One successful hit could save dozens of lives. The deadly interplay of maneuver, firepower, and terrain created a constantly shifting battlefield where instincts were as critical as training. Despite the ferocity of German armor, they were met with staunch resistance at every corner. Narrow streets that seemed like avenues of advance instead became death traps. Tanks could not turn quickly enough. Infantry covering windows and rooftops picked off exposed crew members, while hidden anti-tank teams struck from the flanks. Smoke and snow made visibility nearly zero at times, forcing both sides into near-blind combat. Each movement had to be calculated, each shot measured, as one wrong decision could cascade into a chain reaction of casualties and lost ground. The towns became a labyrinth of peril, each building a fortress, each alley a potential grave. By midday, the streets were scarred with craters from artillery shells, blackened vehicles, and frozen tracks of men and tanks alike. The once innocuous towns had been transformed into a network of kill zones, where American forces leveraged every possible advantage of cover, elevation, and terrain. German forces, while well-trained and equipped, found their momentum severely slowed, their armor repeatedly neutralized, and their infantry funneled into pockets of concentrated fire. For every Panther that broke through, another lay smoldering in a street, an immovable monument to American ingenuity and resilience under pressure. As the sun dipped behind low winter clouds, the battle showed no signs of abating. Smoke and haze created a surreal twilight over the shattered towns, shadows stretching long and distorted across frozen streets. Civilians remained hidden, often risking their lives to move food, water, or information to the defenders. Soldiers, cold and exhausted, took brief respite when possible, constantly scanning for threats, resetting traps, and reinforcing barricades. The towns, though battered and scarred, remained in American hands. Each successful defense, each vehicle stopped, was a testament to careful planning, courage, and the indomitable human spirit fighting against overwhelming odds. By nightfall, the villages had become eerie landscapes of silence and ruin. Fires from destroyed vehicles illuminated the streets intermittently, casting long shadows over the twisted wreckage and snow-covered debris. The air smelled of burnt metal, powder, and smoke, carrying the haunting reminder of the day's violence. German forces, unable to advance without severe losses, regrouped at the outskirts, their pride and momentum stalled. The Americans, while battered and cold, had turned these towns into living kill zones, leveraging terrain, ingenuity, and sheer determination to blunt the advance of one of the most feared armored forces in history. The battle in the Ardennes was far from over, but the lesson of the towns was clear: even the most formidable machine could be tamed by courage, cunning, and unyielding resolve. The first glimmers of morning pierced the blizzard, reflecting off snowdrifts and the icy streets of Stoumont and La Glise. American forces, battered but unbroken, began to move with renewed determination. The long, tense hours of defensive fighting had bought them crucial time, and now the opportunity for counterattack presented itself. Sherman tanks, their green paint dulled by snow and soot, rumbled through the forests and narrow roads, their engines growling like controlled storms. Crews scanned the white haze with cold eyes, every turret a promise of retaliation against the once overwhelming German advance. The soldiers knew that this moment could turn the tide if executed with precision and courage. Infantry teams moved alongside the tanks, their movements synchronized with the armored advance. Bazooka squads, trained in months of brutal winter exercises, slithered through alleys and behind snow-covered barricades, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The forest and village streets, previously a domain of German tanks, were now being contested fiercely as American forces pushed forward with careful, methodical aggression. Each step forward was calculated. Snipers picked off exposed crews, artillery observers adjusted fire to cut off German escape routes, and engineers cleared paths through rubble and frozen debris to maintain the advance. The air was tense, almost electric, as the rhythm of counterattack took hold. The Shermans fired into the narrow streets and tree-lined avenues with brutal efficiency. German infantry, who had spent the previous day pressing forward with confidence, now scrambled to form defensive pockets. Half-tracks that had previously driven through the Ardennes trails were now trapped between snowbanks and overturned carts, their crews pinned under American gunfire. Smoke from destroyed vehicles mingled with the falling snow, creating a disorienting haze that hampered visibility and amplified the chaos. For every Sherman that fired, sparks flew, metal shuddered, and the German line was forced to bend and break, inch by inch, under the pressure of relentless counteroffensive tactics. Bazooka teams moved like shadows along the streets, careful not to expose themselves until the moment was precise. From behind snowbanks and shattered walls, they fired at the flanks of Panthers and half-tracks, each hit sending armor tumbling and engines screeching to a halt. German crews scrambled in confusion, their prior momentum shattered, while American soldiers pressed the advantage, advancing from house to house, alley to alley. Artillery observers, perched on rooftops or slight rises outside town, coordinated with tank commanders to deliver devastating barrages on choke points, creating controlled zones of destruction that limited German mobility and forced them into traps with lethal precision. Morale among American troops soared with every destroyed vehicle, every German soldier neutralized, every foot of territory reclaimed. The cold, which had previously numbed fingers and stiffened limbs, now seemed secondary to the fire of determination that drove them forward. The soldiers' movements were almost choreographed, a deadly dance of tanks, infantry, and artillery converging to squeeze the German forces from all sides. Communication lines buzzed with urgency, orders shouted over radio and field wires, and yet the coordination was tight, a testament to months of preparation and shared resolve in the freezing Ardennes wilderness. German forces, previously confident and mobile, now struggled to respond. Panthers that had cut paths through forests and villages were stalled, forced to take cover wherever possible, while their infantry attempted desperate maneuvers to regroup under the punishing fire. Snowdrifts and ruined buildings became obstacles that favored the defenders turned aggressors. Each American advance was a series of calculated risks. Soldiers exposed themselves briefly to strike, tanks moved into precarious positions to provide fire support, and artillery pummeled areas that might otherwise have allowed the Germans to mount a counterpush. Yet the Americans pressed forward, understanding that momentum was their most valuable weapon. In some streets, hand-to-hand combat erupted as infantrymen closed the distance with German troops who had become trapped in narrow alleys. The clash of bayonets, the echo of rifle butts striking helmets, and the shouts of men intertwined with the roar of engines and the crack of artillery. Bazooka teams, crawling through snow and rubble, struck at vehicles from hidden angles, creating sudden explosions that lit up the streets like flares in the blizzard. Every kill zone was now contested in reverse, the defenders becoming hunters, the hunters being forced into defensive crouches as American forces regained control over key positions. By mid-afternoon, the counterattack had begun to shape the battlefield. German infantry, scattered and exhausted, retreated into temporary cover wherever they could, while armored units struggled to regroup behind smoke and terrain. Sherman tanks, relentless and methodical, destroyed the remnants of Panther and half-track units, while American infantry consolidated gains in houses, crossroads, and strategic alleys. The snow-covered villages, once dominated by German momentum, were now punctuated with the flames of disabled vehicles and the disciplined advance of determined American troops. Each step forward was a mixture of triumph and caution. One misstep could allow the enemy to recover, yet the Americans maintained their pressure, refusing to yield. As the day wore on, U.S. forces carved a path through the Ardennes towns, demonstrating the deadly synergy of armor, infantry, and artillery. Snow swirled in the bitter wind, carrying with it the scent of gunpowder, burning vehicles, and the cold iron tang of blood. The German advance, once seemingly unstoppable, had been checked and pushed back, their confidence replaced by confusion and the harsh realization that the American forces were capable of countering with brutal efficiency. Soldiers on both sides understood that the battle was far from over, but the psychological shift was unmistakable. The momentum had changed, and for the Americans, every foot gained was a step toward turning the tide in the Ardennes. By sunset, the counterattack had firmly established pockets of regained territory. The streets and alleys were littered with wreckage, smoke rising from smoldering vehicles, and frozen footprints marking the relentless advance of determined troops. Sherman tanks, still moving cautiously, were joined by infantry securing every intersection and strategic position. Bazooka teams, ever vigilant, continued to hunt for stragglers, while artillery units prepared to respond instantly to any attempted German countermaneuver. The rhythm of battle, once dictated by the German push, now followed the steady, disciplined beat of American strategy and resolve. The Ardennes winter had become a theater where courage, preparation, and tenacity proved that even the mightiest advance could be turned back with precise, calculated action. The once proud spearhead of the German advance, led by SS Standartenführer Joachim Peiper, began to falter under the relentless strain of the Ardennes winter and the determined American defense. Snow-covered roads, initially perfect for rapid armored movement, had become treacherous corridors of stagnation and vulnerability. Fuel shortages crippled mobility, and the absence of timely resupply convoys left armored units stranded with idling engines and crews tense with frustration. Every Panther, every half-track that had thundered down forest trails now sat immobilized in ditches or behind makeshift barricades, black smoke curling from abandoned vehicles as American artillery and infantry picked off the stalled column. Communication lines were frayed, wires cut by artillery shells or frozen in the bitter cold, leaving Peiper and his officers struggling to coordinate what remained of their forces. Radio transmissions crackled with static and urgency, orders lost or misinterpreted, each misstep compounding the sense of isolation. German troops, trained for rapid blitzkrieg maneuvers, found themselves trapped in a nightmare of attrition rather than the swift victory they had envisioned. Exhaustion etched into every face, frostbite claiming fingers and toes, men trudged through snow-laden roads that offered no cover, only exposure. Morale, once bolstered by confidence and discipline, now wavered under the weight of cold, hunger, and the relentless pressure of American attacks from forested flanks and reclaimed villages. Along the roads and trails, abandoned German vehicles became grim markers of a campaign losing its momentum. Panthers with shattered turrets, half-tracks with immobilized engines, and supply trucks left haphazardly in snowdrifts littered the landscape. American soldiers, advancing cautiously, seized these opportunities to tighten the noose. Bazooka teams crept through the forest, their weapons aimed at the flanks of armored beasts that could no longer maneuver. Artillery observers, perched on rises and hillocks, called in devastating barrages on columns trapped in narrow roads, further bleeding the once formidable spearhead. Each explosion, each destroyed vehicle, compounded Peiper's mounting frustration and the growing sense of inevitability among his men. Peiper's advance, designed to penetrate deep into American lines, began to fracture. Small pockets of resistance became insurmountable obstacles as the forest and winter conditions turned from ally to enemy. Narrow trails that had previously offered rapid movement now slowed the column to a crawl. Snowdrifts blocked wheels and tracks, forcing crews to dismount and attempt makeshift repairs in the freezing wind. Every delay amplified the danger, leaving men exposed to sniper fire, artillery, and the sporadic but deadly strafing of returning U.S. air power. Pilots of P-47 Thunderbolts, previously grounded by thick clouds, now appeared overhead, their dive-bombing runs scattering German troops and igniting fuel-laden vehicles along the beleaguered columns. The psychological toll on Peiper's men was as devastating as the physical hardships. Exhaustion, cold, and hunger combined with fear and frustration, eroding the cohesion that had once made this unit formidable. Soldiers argued over orders, panic flared as vehicles became immobilized, and small groups broke away from the main column, attempting to find alternate routes through forests and villages that were now defended with lethal precision. The scent of burned rubber, fuel, and powder mingled with the crisp winter air, a haunting reminder that the spearhead, once a symbol of unstoppable force, was being systematically dismantled by both terrain and the relentless determination of the Americans. As the day wore on, the attrition became painfully evident. Units that had entered the Ardennes with pride and purpose now limped forward, engines smoking, tracks torn, ammunition dwindling. Peiper attempted to rally his officers, shouting orders over the roar of idling tanks and distant gunfire, but coordination was near impossible. Every maneuver was met with American resistance. Artillery strikes pinned vehicles in place, infantry ambushes delayed movement, and the sudden appearance of Sherman tanks from reclaimed villages forced German armor into defensive crouches. The advancing column had lost the tempo and initiative that defined blitzkrieg, replaced instead by the desperate struggle simply to survive the forest and snow-laden roads. By late afternoon, the toll was unmistakable. Tanks abandoned along the edges of forest trails became grim landmarks, their engines still warm from the futile exertion of movement. Half-tracks that had carried infantry deep into enemy territory now sat useless, their crews retreating on foot to regroup with scattered comrades. Communication with higher command had all but vanished, leaving Peiper isolated and increasingly aware that the advance had peaked, and the opportunity for decisive victory was slipping away with every passing hour. American counterattacks, now coordinated with artillery and air support, continued to harass and attrit the column, turning the forested roads into deadly gauntlets. Nightfall brought no relief. Darkness compounded the challenges. Frozen, narrow roads were difficult to navigate, visibility was near zero, and the howls of wind and the creaking of metal in the cold added to the psychological strain. German troops, huddled around abandoned vehicles or makeshift fires, whispered in tense tones, aware that the spearhead's momentum was gone. Peiper, surveying what remained of his forces, recognized the harsh reality. The once mighty advance had been bled dry by logistical failures, environmental conditions, and the unyielding American defense. The myth of invincible German armor had been stripped away, replaced by the grim arithmetic of attrition, exhaustion, and cold winter inevitability. By the end of the night, the column had ceased to advance meaningfully. German forces hunkered down where they could, improvising defenses amid the frozen wreckage of their own making. American patrols probed the edges, artillery positions monitored every movement, and air power, whenever clouds allowed, strafed and bombed at random intervals, ensuring that Peiper's men could gain no respite. The spearhead, once a symbol of operational brilliance and aggressive momentum, had been reduced to scattered units struggling to survive the Ardennes, marking a decisive psychological and tactical victory for the American defenders. The first light of dawn barely pierced the thick, gray clouds hanging over the Ardennes, but it heralded a terror far more deadly than any tank or rifle, the return of American air power. P-47 Thunderbolts roared into view, their engines splitting the winter air with a sound that sent a shiver through the already exhausted German troops. Peiper's battered columns, already immobilized by fuel shortages, snow, and attrition, now faced a predator from above. The ground troops scattered in panic, unsure where to run as the diving aircraft transformed the forested roads and narrow village streets into death traps. Smoke from previous fights mixed with the exhaust of planes, creating a surreal haze, but it did little to mask the deadly precision of the attacks. The first strikes were devastating. Bombs and rockets found immobilized Panthers and half-tracks in the columns, erupting in violent orange flames against the white snow. Vehicles that had already been rendered vulnerable by snowdrifts and American artillery became instant infernos, their crews trapped or forced to flee into the frigid forest. German soldiers attempted to take cover behind trees, walls, and barricades, but the combination of strafing and explosive ordnance left few safe havens. The air filled with deafening roars, screams, and the metallic crunch of destroyed armor, the battlefield transformed into a nightmare of sound and fire that seemed almost apocalyptic against the winter landscape. Every attempted retreat was met with relentless pressure from above. P-47 pilots, trained for precise ground attack, swooped in at treetop level, strafing columns of soldiers and vehicles alike. Snow kicked up from the retreating troops, mingling with smoke and debris to form a blinding haze, making movement chaotic and disoriented. German infantry, once confident and disciplined, now moved in small, scattered groups, their cohesion destroyed by both fear and circumstance. Commanders shouted orders, but voices were drowned out by the roar of engines and explosions, leaving Peiper's men largely to fend for themselves. The retreat, intended as a controlled withdrawal, dissolved into desperate flight under the punishing hail of bombs and bullets from the sky. American artillery, already positioned along the roads and trails, synchronized perfectly with the air attacks. Every burning Panther or half-track became a focal point for secondary strikes, drawing troops into open zones where the combined effect of air and artillery inflicted maximum damage. Smoke and fire rose in plumes, visible for miles, guiding pilots to their targets and creating a nightmarish tapestry of destruction. What had once been a disciplined armored advance now appeared as a chaotic stream of disoriented soldiers, abandoned vehicles, and frozen, smoke-filled forests. The Ardennes, already harsh in winter, became a gauntlet of fire and chaos that consumed German morale as efficiently as it did their men and machines. German units attempted to regroup wherever possible, but the conditions made coordination nearly impossible. Tanks stalled in snow, half-tracks bogged down, and supply vehicles blocked narrow roads. When small pockets of resistance tried to form defensive lines, P-47s dived with terrifying accuracy, firing rockets and machine guns that shredded both vehicles and infantry. The air was alive with motion, explosions scattered debris, trees were felled by blast waves, and the smell of burning fuel and powder hung thick in the cold air. Every step of the German retreat was contested, and with every hit, the illusion of an organized withdrawal crumbled further. The psychological impact on Peiper's troops was immediate and devastating. Soldiers froze in terror, some huddling behind abandoned vehicles, others attempting to flee into the woods, only to be strafed by dive-bombing aircraft. Communications were fragmented, and the sense of isolation became palpable. Men who had once marched with confidence now moved like hunted animals, their discipline eroded by fear and exhaustion. Even officers struggled to maintain order, their commands lost amidst the roar of engines, exploding ordnance, and the panicked cries of their troops. The retreat had turned into a rout, a spectacle of destruction that marked a dramatic reversal from the initial optimism of the German offensive. As the day progressed, the attrition became catastrophic. Columns of soldiers were reduced to fragmented groups, tanks and half-tracks burned in fields and along roadways, and every attempted regrouping was met with renewed aerial bombardment. Smoke and fire turned the snow into a stained and scarred landscape, dotted with blackened wreckage. German soldiers fled into forests where visibility was low, only to encounter hidden American infantry, artillery, and patrols. What had been a calculated withdrawal became a desperate scramble to survive, as American air supremacy turned every open space into a lethal zone and every road into a death trap. By late afternoon, Peiper's advance was effectively over. The once proud spearhead had been shredded, the remaining vehicles and troops scattered or destroyed. Survivors moved cautiously through the snow, their exhaustion and fear evident in every step. The P-47s circled and returned, ensuring no relief came from above, while artillery continued to monitor roads and forest trails, targeting any attempt at movement. The combination of snow, cold, relentless American ground attacks, and devastating airstrikes had turned what was once a formidable German advance into a shattered, retreating column, leaving only the burnt-out skeletons of tanks and half-tracks as evidence of the initial offensive. Nightfall offered little respite. Fires from destroyed vehicles cast eerie, flickering light across the snow, illuminating the chaos left behind. The remaining German troops huddled in forest pockets, exhausted, terrified, and demoralized. Peiper, surveying the wreckage, realized that the spearhead's momentum had been not just halted, but utterly annihilated. The Ardennes had become a graveyard for the advance, a testament to the combined power of terrain, American defense, and the deadly intervention of air superiority. By the time darkness fully settled, the retreat was no longer just tactical, it was a disaster, a definitive turning point in the battle, and a vivid illustration of how air power could transform the fate of an entire offensive. Night had fallen over the Ardennes, blanketing the devastated forest and villages in darkness, but for Joachim Peiper and his remaining troops, there was no peace to be found. The advance that had once promised glory and rapid penetration into Allied lines had been ground to a halt, leaving only exhaustion, fear, and the bitter realization of failure. Peiper surveyed the remnants of his spearhead, half-tracks abandoned in deep snow, Panthers immobilized along narrow trails, and infantry scattered in small, disorganized groups trying to survive the cold. The sense of isolation was palpable, the cold gnawing at both body and morale. As the realization sank in, there would be no decisive breakthrough. Communication with higher command had effectively collapsed. Radios, once instruments of control and coordination, were now useless, crackling intermittently with static and garbled voices. Orders could not be delivered, reinforcements were non-existent, and the few remaining vehicles were running on dwindling fuel reserves. Peiper, normally confident and commanding, felt the weight of responsibility pressing down like the frozen branches overhanging the forest trails. Every decision carried consequences. Every delay allowed American forces to tighten the noose around his men. The initial momentum of the advance had been replaced by a desperate attempt to simply survive the night. Exhaustion and cold compounded the chaos. Soldiers trudged through knee-deep snow, their boots soaked and frozen, fingers stiff and numb, eyes glazed from fatigue. Even minor injuries became severe threats in the winter wilderness, as frostbite and blood loss sapped strength and willpower. Morale, once bolstered by the pride of training and cohesion, now teetered on the edge of collapse. Muted whispers of despair spread through the ranks, as men glanced at one another with a mixture of fear and resignation. The specter of defeat, once a distant possibility, had become an inescapable reality, and the harsh Ardennes winter showed no mercy. Peiper attempted to consolidate what remained of his forces, gathering small groups into pockets of temporary defense along forest trails and near abandoned villages. Yet coordination was impossible. Some units had become separated entirely, others were immobilized by mechanical failure or snow, and the omnipresent threat of American patrols and artillery made movement perilous. Each surviving soldier was forced to act independently, relying on instinct, training, and sheer determination to navigate through the frozen, chaotic landscape. The spearhead, once a unified, disciplined column, had fractured into scattered survivors, each struggling to find a path out of the wilderness without being annihilated. As the first faint light of dawn began to illuminate the snow-laden forest, Peiper confronted the reality of the situation. The American forces had regained control of strategic roads and villages, artillery and infantry continued to harass any attempted movement, and air power remained a persistent threat whenever clouds parted. The tactical advantages that had once favored the Germans, speed, surprise, and armored superiority, had evaporated in the face of harsh terrain, logistical failure, and relentless enemy resistance. Peiper knew that any further attempts at offensive action were futile. The only option remaining was survival and retreat, and even that was fraught with peril. The physical and psychological strain on Peiper's men was immense. Soldiers huddled around meager fires, trying to thaw frozen hands and stiffened limbs, but the cold seeped into bones and minds alike. Conversations were short, tense, and filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of defeat. Each man carried the weight of the failed advance, witnessing the smoldering remains of tanks and vehicles that once symbolized power and momentum. The winter forest seemed to mock them, each gust of wind a reminder of the relentless environment that had conspired against their success. For Peiper, the battlefield had become a tableau of shattered pride and impossible odds, the culmination of weeks of planning undone by the unforgiving combination of terrain, enemy resistance, and bad fortune. The abandoned vehicles, strewn along forest trails and icy crossroads, told the story of the advance more eloquently than words ever could. Tanks with engines still warm, half-tracks frozen in place, and artillery pieces left behind in haste created a surreal landscape of failure. Peiper's officers tried to instill order, but cohesion was impossible. Small groups drifted apart, improvising routes of escape, scavenging what fuel or ammunition they could, and hoping to survive the long night. The psychological impact of seeing comrades captured or killed added to the burden, reinforcing the notion that the advance, once so confident, had ended not in glory, but in attrition and defeat. As the day wore on, Peiper realized that time was no longer an ally. American forces, recovering from earlier losses, were now capable of pressing the advantage, and the German troops, already exhausted, could not sustain prolonged engagement. Every attempt to regroup or regain momentum was thwarted by terrain, enemy fire, and the relentless cold. The Ardennes, a forested labyrinth of snow, ice, and narrow roads, had become both captor and executioner, leaving Peiper with a stark understanding. The advance was over, and the focus now had to be on survival rather than victory. The spearhead, a symbol of operational ambition, had been shattered by a combination of environmental, logistical, and tactical factors that no single commander could fully control. By late afternoon, Peiper made the difficult decision to abandon the remaining vehicles and focus on moving troops on foot to safer ground. Tanks were left behind, their turrets still intact, engines cold, and supplies depleted. Soldiers carried only what they could, huddling together for warmth and mutual protection. American artillery continued to harass positions, snipers prowled the forest edges, and reconnaissance parties probed for stragglers, ensuring that any movement remained hazardous. The advance, once a symbol of unstoppable force, had been reduced to scattered survival, and the myth of German invincibility in the Ardennes was irrevocably shattered. As night fell, Peiper and his exhausted troops melted into the forest, shadows among the trees, leaving behind the burnt-out wreckage of vehicles and the silence of a battlefield reclaimed by the Americans. The winter wind swept through the Ardennes, carrying the echoes of failed ambition, shattered pride, and the unforgiving reality of war. The lesson was stark: even the most meticulously planned advances, executed with discipline and confidence, could be undone by terrain, logistics, and the indomitable spirit of a determined enemy. Peiper, once a symbol of power, now faced only survival, the end of his advance a testament to the resilience of those he had sought to defeat. Night had fully descended over the Ardennes, blanketing the forest and frozen roads in deep shadows, but for the remaining German forces under Peiper, darkness offered little comfort. The cold was relentless, seeping into bones and biting at exposed skin. As the harsh reality became undeniable, the advance had failed, and every remaining vehicle was a liability rather than an asset. Tanks, half-tracks, and supply trucks, once the pride of the spearhead, were abandoned along forest trails and snow-covered crossroads, their engines still warm but useless without fuel and with crews depleted by exhaustion. Soldiers moved cautiously through the snow, carrying only what they could, leaving behind heavy artillery, armor, and the weight of past ambition. The process of abandoning the vehicles was fraught with tension and danger. Each vehicle left behind was a potential target for American patrols and artillery observers. Soldiers dismantled what could be carried: ammunition, personal weapons, maps, but much of the equipment had to be forsaken. Engines that had roared with confidence earlier in the campaign now fell silent, their hulking frames standing as monuments to the failed advance. The forest, once an obstacle for the Americans, now became the Germans' only shield, offering cover from observation and artillery, yet slowing every step and exposing men to the freezing wind and snow that covered the ground in knee-deep drifts. Movement was slow and deliberate, guided by faint trails and the instinctive knowledge of where roads might lead to safety. Peiper's men, weary and cold, huddled together for warmth as they pushed through the forest, often stepping over abandoned tanks or half-tracks that blocked narrow paths. The metallic scent of burnt fuel and gunpowder lingered in the air, mixing with the crisp aroma of snow and pine, a haunting reminder of the fighting that had taken place. Occasional groans and cries from wounded men punctuated the silence, creating a grim rhythm as the survivors shuffled forward, each step a small victory against fatigue and fear. American forces, aware that the German spearhead was in retreat, pressed cautiously but steadily. Patrols moved along flanking positions, while artillery observers directed fire onto abandoned or partially operational vehicles. Smoke still curled from engines and burning fuel, visible through the trees, signaling positions that were immediately targeted by sharpshooters or indirect fire. German soldiers, forced to leave behind heavy weaponry, now relied solely on personal arms and their wits, moving in small, scattered groups to reduce the risk of mass casualties. Every misstep could prove fatal, yet the men pressed forward, their survival dependent on speed, stealth, and discipline under extreme duress. The abandoned vehicles, left haphazardly along snow-covered roads and forest trails, painted a surreal landscape. Panthers and half-tracks lay tipped over in ditches, some with tracks torn off, others with smoldering turrets from earlier attacks. Supply trucks spilled their contents into snowbanks, their cargo abandoned in haste. American artillery and infantry sporadically pounded these positions, ensuring that nothing could be salvaged quickly and that German forces could not regroup easily. The Ardennes had been transformed from a theater of rapid mechanized advance into a graveyard of steel, ice, and smoke, a stark testament to the harsh winter, strategic missteps, and relentless enemy pressure. Peiper's men, despite exhaustion, moved with grim determination. Every step forward was measured, avoiding open fields whenever possible, using fallen trees, snowdrifts, and terrain contours as cover. Crews that had once manned tanks now dragged weapons and essential supplies on sleds or on their backs, moving in silence save for whispered commands and warnings. Nightfall compounded the challenges. Visibility was minimal, and the risk of encountering American patrols or ambushes was ever present. Yet, abandoning the vehicles was not merely a logistical necessity, it was survival. Each abandoned tank, each forsaken half-track, was a conscious concession to reality, a recognition that the German spearhead's momentum had been irrevocably broken. The forest trails were a gauntlet in themselves. Snow-covered roots and uneven ground slowed movement, while the bitter wind cut through clothing and armor alike. Men who had marched with confidence in the sunlit Ardennes now stumbled through knee-deep snow, carrying whatever they could salvage. The psychological burden was immense. Every glance at a destroyed tank or burnt-out half-track reminded soldiers of comrades lost, missions failed, and the once unstoppable advance reduced to mere survival. Even officers struggled to maintain cohesion, as groups splintered into smaller units, improvising routes through the forest in hopes of linking back with the main body or reaching American lines under less hostile conditions. Occasional skirmishes flared as retreating Germans encountered small, determined American units. A suppressed rifle shot, a sudden burst of fire from a machine gun, or a brief artillery strike reminded the men that the threat was unceasing. Every abandoned vehicle, every piece of heavy equipment, now served as both obstacle and lure for the Americans, who exploited the chaos to further reduce the remnants of Peiper's once mighty spearhead. Despite the dire circumstances, the German soldiers pressed onward, their discipline and survival instincts tested to the absolute limit by cold, exhaustion, enemy fire, and the omnipresent snow. By early morning, the German retreat continued in small, scattered groups. Tanks and half-tracks, left behind as burdens too heavy to move, were now silent witnesses to the failure of the offensive. Peiper's men had shed the material weight of war to increase mobility, carrying only essential weapons and supplies. The forest, which had initially channeled their advance, now became a lifeline, offering cover from observation and artillery fire as they slipped through the snow, leaving behind the armored remains of the failed campaign. Each abandoned vehicle symbolized not only loss but also the resilience of those who survived, a painful reminder that survival required sacrifice, speed, and unyielding caution. As daylight broke, the Ardennes revealed the full scale of the retreat's aftermath. The forest trails and frozen roads were littered with abandoned armor, supply trucks, and equipment, the burned and immobilized hulks standing as stark reminders of the failed advance. Peiper's men, reduced in number and stripped of heavy firepower, continued their cautious trek through the snow, aware that survival, not victory, was now their primary objective. The once proud spearhead had been shattered, its armored power left to the cold and snow, and the battlefield now belonged to those who had weathered the storm and pressed forward with determination and tenacity. The snow-covered Ardennes forest was silent now, but the devastation left in the wake of Peiper's failed advance told a story of chaos, destruction, and ultimate defeat. Burnt-out tanks and half-tracks littered the forest trails, their blackened hulls stark against the pristine white of the snow. Artillery shells had shattered trees and buildings alike, leaving the landscape scarred and unrecognizable. Smoke still rose from smoldering wrecks, twisting into the gray sky, a lingering reminder of the ferocity of the battle. For the Americans, the silence was hard-won, a testament to endurance, coordination, and the relentless defense that had turned the tide in the Ardennes. Survivors from Peiper's column moved cautiously through the forest in small, disorganized groups. Frostbitten and exhausted, they carried what little they could salvage, their morale battered by both the weather and the relentless pressure they had faced. Many soldiers were captured by advancing American patrols, while others fled into the woods, attempting to evade detection, yet all were acutely aware that the spearhead had ended not in victory, but in failure. The myth of unstoppable German armored might, carefully cultivated through months of propaganda and battlefield success, had been irrevocably shattered by terrain, attrition, and the determined American counterattack. The towns of Stoumont, La Glise, and the surrounding villages bore the marks of a brutal, mechanized struggle. Streets that had once been filled with civilian life were now scarred with craters, rubble, and abandoned vehicles. Houses and shops had been damaged by shelling and gunfire, some reduced to smoking ruins. Civilians emerged cautiously from basements and hidden shelters, witnessing the wreckage left behind by a force that had once seemed invincible. The Americans moved systematically through these towns, clearing debris, securing positions, and taking prisoners, their disciplined presence turning the chaos into order. The winter sun reflected off broken windows and frozen snow, illuminating a landscape that had been transformed into a theater of destruction and survival. Artillery positions and Sherman tanks established along key crossroads reinforced the regained American control. Each destroyed Panther or immobilized half-track became a symbol of triumph, a testament to both strategic foresight and tactical execution. The surviving German forces were scattered, demoralized, and retreating, while the Americans consolidated gains and prepared for any possible counterattacks. Smoke, fire, and the acrid tang of fuel and gunpowder hung heavy in the air, mixing with the crisp scent of snow and pine. The battlefield, though quiet now, bore the scars of relentless engagement and the strategic collapse of the once feared spearhead. Peiper's failed advance became a lesson in the limits of mechanized warfare under adverse conditions. Tanks, once symbols of unstoppable force, had been immobilized by snow, terrain, and logistical failures. Infantry, separated from support and exposed to American fire, had been fragmented and scattered. Even air power, when it returned, had compounded the chaos, leaving the German forces with no room to maneuver. The combination of cold, exhaustion, and unrelenting American defense had transformed a potentially decisive offensive into a slow-motion disaster, leaving nothing but burnt-out vehicles, frozen roads, and scattered survivors in its wake. American soldiers moved among the wreckage, cautious but determined. Patrols secured key positions, marking destroyed vehicles and clearing streets, while medics attended to wounded and exhausted prisoners. Each step forward solidified control over the towns and surrounding forest, turning the once feared German advance into a cautionary tale of hubris and overextension. Morale among American forces soared, reinforced by the knowledge that careful planning, tactical skill, and coordinated defense had successfully repelled a force that had seemed unstoppable just days earlier. The Ardennes winter, harsh and unforgiving, had been wielded as an ally by the defenders, magnifying the challenges for the attackers and amplifying the effectiveness of every well-placed counterattack. By nightfall, the forest and villages were under complete American control. Burnt-out Panthers and half-tracks, frozen supply trucks, and scattered weaponry remained as silent witnesses to the defeat of Peiper's column. Survivors from the German side either surrendered, fled into the surrounding forests, or regrouped in isolated pockets, knowing that the offensive was irretrievably lost. The Americans, meanwhile, secured key positions, tended to the wounded, and prepared for further operations, confident that the spearhead had been decisively neutralized. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. For the Germans, the illusion of invincibility had been shattered. For the Americans, the success validated months of training, resilience, and tactical ingenuity. The aftermath of the battle also highlighted the human cost of the Ardennes campaign. Frozen corpses of soldiers lay scattered among the wreckage, a stark reminder of the harsh winter and relentless combat. Abandoned vehicles, still bearing the marks of artillery and bazooka strikes, stood as monuments to the clash of firepower and the brutal arithmetic of attrition. The snow, once a neutral element, had become a silent witness to courage, failure, and survival, preserving the marks of tracks, footprints, and tire ruts that told the story of one of the most intense episodes of mechanized warfare in the campaign. Every destroyed tank, every frozen road, every scarred village became part of the enduring memory of the battle. Ultimately, the end of Peiper's spearhead marked a decisive moment in the Ardennes campaign. The German offensive, designed to shatter Allied lines and strike deep into the heart of Belgium, had been neutralized through the combined efforts of determined American defense, coordinated counterattacks, and the unforgiving winter terrain. The forest, villages, and snow-covered roads now lay in quiet ruin, a testament to the resilience of the defenders and the limits of even the most well-equipped and trained armored force when faced with relentless opposition. The myth of German invincibility in the Ardennes had been irrevocably broken, leaving only the lessons of sacrifice, strategy, and survival etched into the frozen landscape. As the first stars emerged in the crisp winter sky, the Americans secured the remaining positions, tending to the wounded and processing prisoners, while the scattered remnants of Peiper's forces slipped silently into the forest, humbled and defeated. The Ardennes winter had claimed victory for the defenders, its forests and snow-covered roads a stage for courage, endurance, and tactical acumen. The end of the spearhead was not only a military triumph but a symbolic testament to resilience, marking the failure of a once proud offensive and the enduring spirit of those who had fought to stop it.